bemoaning a little bit that this idea that public education has missed the data revolution. That's really more of a prod to get people to perk up and get as interested in data as we are, and start using it more aggressively in the decision-making process. So we're going to actually offer a new tool today. We've been working on, in partnership with the National Center, with Department of Ed funding, a new tool that allows users to download ready formatted data displays that they can start using in their decision making. So that's what we have today. And honestly, it turns out it's kind of complicated to pull this off. So we're pretty excited. We've made it this far. It's taken a lot of people, a lot of work to do it. And I'm sure there's some bugs still in there somewhere, but we're excited to show it to you today and get your ideas for how people might use the data in different settings. So I'm going to dive right in. First of all, just a reminder, who decides how to spend the public dollars we have for schools in the US? The answer there is school boards and district leaders. Oftentimes we forget how much of the decision-making is actually happening at districts. We get sort of fixated on what's going on at states or the federal government, but really it's the thousands of school districts around the country that are making decisions about how to spend the money. So if we don't get data into their hands, then we can't affect those spending decisions that are happening. So that's been a really big push for us. And, historically, district leaders have been making these decisions without reliable, relevant data on how their dollars are currently deployed and what effect those dollars are having on students. But that, we're kind of in a moment right now because we now have all this outcomes data by school, and we've added in spending data by school, thanks to the hard work that the states have done in assembling those data. And with this new set of data, it's the sort of perfect baseline for which we can start building out really relevant displays for school districts. So over the last couple of years, a lot of activity has been going on. Many of you know the states have been working hard on their school by school spending, but also the federal government has funded, through the National Center, a big pilot project. And so this pilot project brought together 26 districts that we worked with across the country to learn about what kinds of data displays work, how do you, what happens when they bring them to meetings, where do they need support on this kind of stuff. And it was those 26 districts that really fed a lot of information into the tool that you're going to see today. So some of you are seeing some districts you recognize. And so, the leaders in these districts, I think, have been really generous with their time, looking at their data, willing to look at sometimes data that wasn't what they expected, bring it to meetings, come back and tell us how that went, and so on. So what we have found across all these different districts is that the data visualizations work. They fuel thoughtful and productive conversations on topics like equity, resource allocation, and school improvement. And what we've done is really, this was our big question, really refine them along the way based on the feedback that we got from people. So I want to jump in here and tell you we have this new tool. And I think in the chat, you'll get the link to the tool, and I'll walk you through it in a moment. But it has these 4 displays. Here's the information on the 4 displays. And then along the left, you can actually select the displays. And the tool is the equivalent of a one-stop shop. So we'll have the site gives you these information on each of the displays. It gives you some questions to explore. It includes some comms training, background on the data, but it's basically all the pieces right here to access and get the information on these tested visualizations. So our hope is that with the data handy, the data can be used to drive productive conversations to improve education. So I'll just dive right into display number one. So you basically are over here. There's a state, you choose your state. It should pre-populate your districts. You choose a district. And then what you do is you select a comparison. Right now we're on comparison number one, which is these bar charts of the schools inside this district that will show you how much money historically anyway has been spent on each school. So what you can district can do right away is to look at the bars. The bars are color coded. The dark red are schools with higher concentrations of students, or low-income students or economically disadvantaged. Green means a much smaller portion of those. They tend to be middle class or wealthier students who attend those schools. So you can see this color coding. We don't love the color coding, but it turned out in our testing of the data that color coding made the most sense to people. If it bothers you, you can change it here. But the other thing to notice is that the top sliver on each bar is the federal money. So what we're seeing right here is so that's that federal money, is a way to sort of allow somebody right away to say, is this district giving our highest poverty schools more money? And in this particular district, the answer is not so much, right? We have some high poverty schools that are on the lower spending level and some that are on the higher spending level. We have some kind of mid poverty level schools that are all over the place. One here with quite a bit less money, down at $12,000 a student. There are always other things going on in the background that the individual principals and the district can bring to that conversation. But here's sort of our baseline of how the money is being spent across the different schools. And when we did the pilot, we learned some things. And first and foremost, that most districts and school leaders hadn't seen these numbers. They had not yet interacted with the school by school financial data. The pilot was the first time. So they had a lot of questions. They were so surprised by some things. They brought some explanations to the table, like, oh, that's a school with a lot of kids in a very specialized special needs program, or is that because of salaries or things like that? But it took a few minutes for people to process it because it really was the first time they were seeing it. Likely that's because, all this data got submitted up through the report cards. It was hard to look at it on a comparison basis in most states, that we don't really build in these processes to look at the data, but now we have the chance to. And I will say here on this display and many of the others that are coming up, it's October. That means next month is November. And I know you're thinking what I'm thinking. That means budgeting starts in school districts. That's what you were thinking, right? It has to be what you were thinking, because what else is there going on in November? Nothing else I can think of, just that budgeting season starts. And when budgeting season starts, districts sit down and start to pull together their early drafts of the budget. And one of the most amazing things to shove in the pile of paper as you're going to have a meeting on the budget would be a display like this. So people could say, do we want to do something about the school that's getting less money? Do we want to try to drive more money into our higher poverty schools? If we don't do that early on in the budget process, we're not likely to make changes, certainly not at the end. It's too late. So November, December, these are the months. This is a very moment you want to be pulling these data and putting them into that budgeting process. Does budget season ever end? No, probably not. Okay, so here's another district. This was a district also in our pilot. You can see here some districts, mostly only have high poverty schools or low poverty schools. So you don't always see as much of a color coded mixture in the same way that you do on this one. But you can see right here is another district where, wow, two of their wealthiest schools are drawing down over $14,500 a student. And on the other end, we have some elementary schools that are down here at $10,000 a student that are much higher poverty. So a lot to think about in this particular district. and first and foremost, should we be spending so much more on these wealthier schools, and how do we get here? And is there something we should change slowly or not? So in working with the pilot district, so basically you get this picture and then you can click it down here, print this report, and you can take this picture to a meeting, or everybody in a training can download it on their own district and turn to the person next to them and start talking about it and processing it. One of the things we found when people were exposed to these data for the first time was they tended to focus on the trees, not the forest. So they would say things like, yeah, I see down here, Nature Ridge, that doesn't look right. I've got a question about that one. What's going on? I think there's that program here, or I think we changed it last year, and didn't sort of take stock of the whole picture, which at least in this district is that we're not successfully directing more money to our higher poverty schools. And so, does that mean we want to take a step back and figure out how we do a better job of putting our dollars in the schools with the highest needs students? And so we saw a lot of that. So it was like this tendency for the brain to kind of dig in on a specific thing that seems off or questionable or some other issue, and not see the big picture. It takes a little bit of time, but with some prompting, I think most of them do. So
Marguerite,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Adish is asking, are there any data sources more recent than 1819? So we do have for some states 1920, and we are starting to pull in 21 and 22 as the states are releasing them. So we are working on updating these as quickly as we can. So for those state agencies who are on, we would love your updated, most recent data files, and we will get it in there. It's just sometimes it's a little bit slow going if we have to scrape it all.
Right. So yeah, more soon, because that's also something we heard, which was honestly that it's hard to have a conversation when the data are a few years old. However, I will say that if you're bringing the data to a district for the first time, sometimes it's a little less stressful to look at data that are outdated because you have this distance on it. So we can sort of size it up and people can make their guess. Do you think we're better at it now? Do you think we're more intentional, or have we taken care of that problem? Do you think that number changed? And then when the newer data comes out, we can dig in and process that. But it should be soon. In some places a month, some places a little bit longer. So we'll have more data soon. So another big finding for us was a tendency to ignore the big money. And by that, I mean, so a lot of times districts would say, oh, well, we have our federal program and that school brings a reading coach. And we would say, well, also there's all the teachers, the principal, the nurse, the librarians. That's all the money spent on the school. So when you're looking toward how much money you've invested, you don't want to just think of the small slice of the new program we've added, or the small slice of something that just got recently put in there by the state or things like that. You really want to take stock of all the dollars. All the dollars is what's available to help kids achieve what they need to achieve. And looking at only a small slice of that, I think, was often distorting for people. So the chart here helps with that. But you can imagine there was some uncomfortable conversations, not that we were pressing, we were asking people to take stock of them, but it is really natural for people to be defensive at first. And a lot of people would say, well, most of this is just differences in salaries because some teachers are more senior, so what? And we would say, well, if that's something that feels good in your community and you think that's intentional, that's fine. If you're getting the high results out of it for your high poverty schools, maybe you're okay with that. If you're tying up a lot of money in senior salaries at these schools way over to the right, and that money isn't available to potentially help kids improve in math or reading at some of your higher poverty schools, well, that's a decision you're making too. Those are all decisions. So let's do a poll on this. What do you suspect will draw the most attention? That the patterns will surprise folks? Why are we seeing this for the first time? Do you think that will draw some of the attention here is the uneven spending is caused by uneven teacher salaries, that most people will go toward the special programs or the magnets, and we did see that in some of the data. Our sense was that every district has a different story to tell. That lower needs schools are sometimes getting less money, not always, by the way. In fact, many cases they're not, but when they do, that is sort of eye-popping, right? Or the small or under-enrolled schools. We did see this in many places that have higher costs associated, sometimes higher cost and lower outcomes as well, or something else. So but basically what I'm doing is giving you a laundry list of the kinds of things that came up in our conversations. Jessica, every one of these came up in our conversations, wouldn't you say?
Definitely.
Yeah. And so, what do you think will get most attention in where you are or in your region or in the people you interact with? And wow, it's a little bit of everything. So let's put up the poll results. Why are we seeing this for the first time? That first question is often coupled with, are you sure these numbers are correct? So generally in states, it's the districts who supply those numbers to the state, and then the state is just reporting them. So usually they are the district's numbers. So if you're unhappy with the way the math was calculated for those, it's only in your district's best interest to go back and get those numbers cleaned up.
So Margaret, let's just clarify a little bit on the money here. So Luke is asking, are the per pupil amounts in the displays the actual figures reported by the districts, or there are any adjustments? There are not adjustments made. These are the numbers that were reported on the report cards. And then Wendy's asking, these slides are only showing ESSER funds or all title. So these are for 18-19. So there wasn't ESSER yet. So these are all funds, all public funds, federal, state, local.
Federal, local, anything that counts as a public dollar is in there. That's why you're seeing higher numbers like $14,000 per student. That's all of that money. It includes each school's share of money spent at central office.
And it excludes capital, though, to the James's question, excludes capital, things like debt services.
Excludes, right. Yeah. So they're really just the annual the kinds of money that would go in that total current expenditures figure that the federal government has districts pretty well trained on reporting.
Well, and I will caution, though, to some effects that some states did do things like exclude transportation or food service to this next question. So in that case, they would be excluded, but generally speaking, it is all total current expenditures.
And special ed. So special ed, as you might guess, sparks a lot of conversation because some people will immediately say, oh, all of the differential is special ed. And generally people wanted to attribute more of the patterns to special ed than we could really see in the data. But I will say that hallelujah, the federal government is going to separately code special ed in its next round of data. So someday we might be able to itemize that and be able to have that conversation. A district could easily, right, itemize it. But sometimes we would hear district leaders say, well, that school has a self-contained classroom, and that's what's driving up the costs. And we'd say, well, how many employees do you have working in that self-contained classroom? They would say, we have 2. We would add up the cost divided by the students and say, well, that only moves the dollar figure by $400 a kid, and they're spending $4,000 more. So there's something else that's going on besides special ed. So anyway, you guys are exactly, kind of coming up with the very same things that we saw. Great questions, though. Keep them coming. So I want to go to the next expenditure, the next displays. Again, the buttons at the top tell you about the display. If you want to see the display, you'd select a comparison. This is display number 2. And these are our classic scatter plots, which we absolutely love. And what you can do is kind of customize it to say, I only want to look at elementary, middle, or high, or I want to look at all the schools in this district. So this is just the schools in one district. And again, here, a few things to note, which is that we have the color coding. Each circle is a school. And if it's red, it's a higher concentration of low-income students. If you see a plus sign, that's a charter school. The circles are district schools. And the size of the circle corresponds to the size of the school. So larger schools are larger circles, and it allows us to see some patterns that are going on with the size of the school here. So in this district, I did Green Bay. That's close-ish to where I am right now in northern Wisconsin. So you can see here that some of the schools that are red, higher poverty schools, are indeed in this district getting some more money. We can see that. So the district's doing a good job of getting more money to those higher poverty schools, but that the money isn't yielding as higher outcomes for the low income students. So you see they're down in this quadrant down here where they cost more, but they have lower outcomes relative to the other schools in the district. The quadrants are labeled because our finding was that people really did have a hard time reading this graph without those labels. So you see these little text boxes in the corner that say these schools spend more than their peers and have lower outcomes there. So I want to go through these. This is one you just look at your own district for this one. And what we found when we brought these displays to districts was that leaders needed a little bit of nudging to engage on leveraging the dollars for student outcomes. So they would look kind of backwards, but not forwards. Like, how do we take the money, let's say the school way over here, right? $17,500 small school, and say, well, if we're going to invest that much per student in this small school, how do we make sure that the students are getting some value and we're seeing real outcomes for their kids? Or similarly, for even some of our other ones, like maybe this school, we have $13,000 a kid, and there's some other similarly low income schools by the same color that have higher outcomes than that one. So how do we take the money that we've invested in school and make sure we're getting those high outcomes? It just took a little bit of nudging to have those conversations. I think they were still very new for people. So yeah, the assessments right now are these end of year state accountability assessments. Hopefully these will, get better over time. But that's what we have uploaded. That's sort of the different assessments in different states, but that's what we have on there. So this is Sheboygan. It's kind of on this Wisconsin theme for this one's a Sheboygan district. I'm now at comparison number 3. This is just elementary schools and just high poverty ones. So what we did here, Sheboygan is a bigger district than this. And we've only pulled out their high poverty schools here. In the background, you can see the similar high poverty schools for the rest of Wisconsin. And so when you look at this particular one, so you can say, well, it's spending a little bit more than the state average, and it's getting higher outcomes, even when compared to schools of similar poverty levels. This is what people needed to be able to start to make sense of the data. This school over here is a more expensive school, and we could say to this school, you're getting close to $16,000 a student, which is more than we see for high poverty elementary schools in other areas of Wisconsin, and your outcomes are a little bit lower, right? So that's what we're doing with this display number 3 is we are trying to say that, apples to apples, in the sense high poverty schools to high poverty schools elsewhere in the state, and how do I start comparing them? And people need those legitimate comparisons in order to be able to process the information. If you are a high poverty school, you don't want to be told to compare yourself to the country club wealthy school across the way. You want to compare yourself to other high poverty schools around the state. So that's what we're doing with that one. Here is the same display in Durham, North Carolina. So Durham has some high poverty elementary schools. You can see them right here. And several of them are getting more money than other high poverty elementary schools in North Carolina. So that's the shaded one back here. And really have quite a bit lower outcomes than their peers. And this is where I would want to sit down and have a conversation, both with the principals and with the district leaders, and say, what do you think will work? We have the money, whether maybe we're not using it on the right things, maybe we're not using the right curriculum, maybe we're not, there's something going on here, but our kids, our high poverty kids, are underperforming other high poverty kids around the state, and the dollars are here, right? They're in the building. They're just not working to deliver outcomes for kids. I mean, the average among high poverty kids is more closer to 50%, and we've got some schools where they have under 30% rates at which they are proficient in English and math. So we're really good. It allows us to say, well, they might be underperforming other schools in Durham, but when you just do apples to apples high poverty schools, then maybe that allows us to kind of roll up our sleeves and go back and look again at what we might be able to do. So yes, well, Wendy is all ready for my next question. So let me ask you all this, and we can put this in the chat. We're going to get to the next one in a moment, Wendy, which is comparison number 4. But let me ask you this. Do you think, is it fair for the superintendent to say, we spend more on this school than other high poverty peers, and yet we're getting lower outcomes? Do you think it's fair to say that? Feel free to put it in the chat. I'm curious what you think. I mean, I will tell you that a lot of people just have a hard time talking about this, and so they don't say it. And what we found in many cases that the principals in these schools don't know that. So some of you are saying yes, Jacob's saying, and Janine saying, nope, don't even say it. Don't even say it out loud. I know that's not what you're saying. I'm putting words in your mouth, but not fair to stop with that question. Well, I think that it's not a question. It's a statement. The question I'm asking you all is it fair to say that? I think it's fine to be open to a response, like, and we did some work on this with a district where their data looked a lot like this, a different state. And the principal said, in my sense, we don't get permanent staff until October or sometimes November. Our schools are last in line for the new hires, and we often start the first 2 months with subs. And if we are really going to turn it around, we need the district to prioritize our school first for hires. I can't have all these substitutes in there for 6 to 8 weeks. And I thought that was really powerful and probably accurate. So it could be the case that, you say this thing and now you've learned something from the school in their response, and you can have a productive conversation back and forth about this. I mean, if the school says, well, there's something we could do, our kids are low income. The point here is to say, well, actually there's low income kids all over the state that are outperforming your school. And if they say, well, then we would need more money, we say, well, I think we have money. We may not be using it on the right things, but I want to hear your ideas about what's going wrong. And the school can start to say things like, well, we've had a lot of turnover, or, we had this problem last year with, I don't know, a school shooting or something, and we need really to kind of rebuild our culture. And you move into problem solving mode if and only if you've actually acknowledged the problem. And what we often hear when we say this, and everybody who knows me knows I tend to run on the blunt side. And so for me, I would just say it, and I would expect somebody else to just say what they thought back, and let's figure out the issue here. So can people let me know if you can hear me? Because
hear you just fine, Marguerite. And Chuck's asking, do we
Okay.
ever see smaller schools, like less than 300 students, that are performing better or that cost less? Like, yes, Chuck, we do see that. In some districts, they don't supplement smaller schools, especially in places that have fewer schools overall in a district. There's no room for that kind of maneuvering among schools. Margaret, you want to add any more?
Yeah, we just dug into that data in both California and Ohio, and we found plenty of small schools that cost more, but plenty of them that didn't, and many of the ones that didn't actually were outperforming their peers. So you can use these tools to sort of look into those patterns. And even if you look at this graph right here, this picture, look at these small schools. These are some small schools with high poverty kids that are outperforming their peers and doing so on less than average expenditures. So here's another one, and here's another one. You can see them right in the picture of there. Okay, so and I think that, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in. So Wendy, the green buttons at the top describe the display you'll see. You'll need to select the displays in the left-hand navigation that you want to see. So Margaret, maybe you can, yeah, perfect. That's where you would select which of the visualizations you'd like to see. And I really appreciate Carol's comment here about like, how do you continue to guide and facilitate the conversations, and thinking about some video kind of dialogue or descriptions. As we said, this is kind of like the first rollout of this, and we're starting in this next year in our work with the National Center to build out those additional resources. So really appreciate that, and we'll take that to heart.
Well, I think you'll have some coming up here in the slides, but I also want to point out that that for a lot of people, I think they've worried that data has brought judgment, or that data is weaponized somehow. And I think you might have to say that, it's hard to talk about data without people feeling bristling, and maybe they just need to bristle for a minute and get to the other side of it. I worry that if we don't talk about the data and really say out loud what the data say, people don't hear it. So they don't hear it, and they don't know it, and then they don't proceed in a way that it can problem solve, drive continuous improvement and start fixing the problems that are really evident in the data. So some of you are communications tools. So we have some of those, and we did work on that with the pilot districts.
So Margaret,
Yep.
Really fast. We also have a comment from Jacob about wondering what the distribution would look like if we looked at median versus average. So that is a change that was very recently made. So in the tool, when you're in there, you are actually looking at median, not average on those lines.
We made the slides, then we changed that to median for all sorts of reasons, because, well, for reasons that if you're asking, you likely know the answers to. So,
and I love this. Data is a flashlight, not a hammer.
Yes. Thank you for that. And I will say that, that in education, we are just really nervous about saying these things out loud unless we have a solution to go with them. But that sometimes precludes the back and forth, the information sharing between principals and district leaders with board, et cetera, that can get people oriented and focused on fixing the problem every day and for the long haul, not just like in a one-time way. So let's show you this this district. So this is Bellingham. We're now over in Washington State in the northern part, a lot of evergreen trees and deep, dark, cold lakes up in Bellingham. And what you can see here is that it's another district where here the highest poverty schools are kind of more in that mid-range of poverty. So the display generates as the background similar schools with about the similar levels of poverty. And again, in Bellingham, you can see they have spending somewhere between 14 and 19-ish $1,000 per student on their schools, and their outcomes are lower than their peers. So I start to look at these data and I say, but in Bellingham, college nearby and stuff like that, the resources are around to really kind of dig in and figure this out. Is it possible we're using an outdated reading curriculum? Are we not oriented on trying to get our kids up to speed in the academic subjects as much as elsewhere in Washington State? What is it about our schools that were quite a bit lower performing than similar schools with similar levels of poverty around around the state here. So it's a similar kind of story, but you'll see the different comparison group because Bellingham didn't have any of the highest poverty schools in there. Sean is saying, reiterating the concern about weaponizing the data. So we have some comments for you for a minute, because as you can imagine, some of that came up in our pilot for sure. So what we're going to do now, one more in the number 3 display. This is New York City, and what's fascinating here are the patterns based on size. So these are only the high poverty elementary schools. And of course, there are a lot of them because it's New York City. But what you can see pretty quickly here is that we have a lot of very expensive, look at these numbers because it's New York City, $33,000, $31,000 of student, high poverty, small schools with really low outcomes. At the same time, we're spending maybe $10,000 less than that on some of these larger schools, and they are actually quite a bit more successful with our highest poverty students. So I think, and this feeds into an ongoing debate right now in New York, which is whether or not we should be protecting these schools from any sorts of cuts. But at a minimum, we might want to ask these schools, what ideas do they have for these additional resources to make sure that they are delivering higher outcomes. So if you're a school with only maybe 250 kids and you still have the same complement of staff, should your kids be getting a little bit more focused attention? And should, with those kinds of ratios of nurses and counselors and principals and teachers, should we be, making sure our students are successful? And what does it mean for the viability of some of these small schools if we spend a lot of money and we still don't get very great outcomes? Especially when you can see that we've got some small schools over here elsewhere in the district that might have higher outcomes without necessarily the same price point, or even at the same price point. Take a look at some of these, $33,000, $31,000, and they are delivering higher performance for their kids. So you guys are doing what many people would do. It's just want more variables, right? So in future iterations, we're hoping to add more filters. So you could do things like you're asking for, to just look at rural or urban, because there are differences when you try to compare across those, and to be able to make some of those. We've run those comparisons for people, and that I think can be helpful.
Kelly's saying, I'm amazed at the large district comparisons across the country. There goes my whole day.
I call it a cocktail party killer, Kelly. Take it to your friends, bring it to a party. The party's over. The
party's not over. Those are my favorite parties, or data parties.
Everyone's going to go to their phone and never look up.
I do want to take a moment just to reiterate a couple of the in the process, we are building out some additional communications tools, but there are some that do exist on this site already. So at the top, right above the display, there are tabs and there's questions to explore by role. So there would be questions for district leaders to explore, for parents and community members to explore when they look at the displays. There's also a tab called background, and that has background on the pilot, including a link to a communications tool that was developed for district leaders on how they can share these displays with their communities. And then under the state leader tab under questions to explore, there is an additional resource there for using these in potentially in resource allocation reviews. So lots already in here, but wanted to make sure you guys knew where to find it, and we'll continue to build those out and kind of pull them out and highlight them in different ways.
And Craig, you can see the scale on the poverty when you go log on the site. So the darker red. So what we're looking at here probably is the difference between 70 and 100% poverty.
It's also in the top. It pulls into the top of the picture too. In the title.
Yeah, you'll get to see that when you go and log in on there. And we did see very different patterns in different districts. Like I feel like every district's data has a different story to tell. And, we can just like go around the country. We've looked at, hundreds of these anyway, some of us find the data very, very entertaining. So one more I will say, and again, these are the very kinds of displays that you could bring to a budget meeting and say, how does this affect how we're thinking about the budget? And usually these budget meetings start happening in November. So this is a really great time, and they are outdated for the data, but you could bring them and say, what do we think our patterns look like now? How do we want to think about it? Because making changes in spending in districts often takes several years, and you might want to lay the groundwork now. So, so the last display is number 4, is just high schools. So you're comparing the high school or schools for your district compared to the rest in the state. And we were kind of going around different corners of the country. So now we're down in San Diego, really Southern California. And you can see that in Southern California, there's really a lot of variation in the performance across the high schools, down here at 10%, 20%, all the way up here toward 80% achievement levels. And so I would say if I were in San Diego, I might say, wow, given the big variation, do we want to really double down and focus on making sure that we are getting some of these lower performing high schools across the line here and getting some really targeting our improvement, less about district-wide changes and more, at least in this district for the high schools, really targeted changes in some of our lowest performing schools, because there's such a wide variation. And just that's another choice districts have. Do we do something district-wide, like we purchase new curriculum for everybody and we have 2 professional development days for everybody? Or do we take those resources and we really target them into selected schools? And at least as far as high schools in San Diego, I would say targeting seems like the right approach now, because we have such low performance in some of our schools. A little bit of spending variation, but not a whole lot, $1,000 to $2,000 difference between these. And in San Diego, compared to the rest of the state, really a lot of their schools are spending a little bit less than the average in the less than the average for the state. And Jack is offering to give us more recent data. Is that right? And so if you want to give us more recent data, we can add that in. Laura, how would somebody go about doing that?
I'm putting my email address in here right now.
Okay, great. All right. So these are some high schools. I thought I would do this one. We're back up in Washington State again. This is Bremerton, home of that recent, the praying coach court case. So I thought it was kind of interesting. A lot of attention on that district over the coach. And I was thinking, well, they got these 2 high schools, are spending more, than a lot of their peers here. And they're lower performing than the rest of the schools in the state. And so maybe at least going forward, they want to try to disproportionately spend their time on getting these kids up academically, so they have a lot more options after high school. And I look at that when I see it. Anytime I see a high school with some of this lower performance, that's what worries me. But it allows a district to do that both on the spending. The money is there, right? This is a school that has more money in it than many of its peers. You can see in the background of its peer high schools that have higher performance. And okay, so on that one, I think we can say that the biggest high school is performing a bit below. Should the district make a push to improve outcomes? If that should be a big goal as part of this next budget season, then we're talking both about the money and the outcomes. And that, I think, is our goal with these data, is really how do we merge these 2 conversations, the part about the money and the part about the outcomes? How do we all start to think like an economist? What are we getting for this investment we're making, and what ideas do people have to try to leverage dollars in ways that get even more value for their kids?
So Margaret, I'll just step in quickly if I can, because we're getting a couple of questions in the chat, and I really appreciate it. So people are looking at different filters and they're saying that they might not be seeing all of their schools, or some of their schools are missing either all elementaries or all their high schools. So in some cases, we did not get proficiency data. And so those schools would be missing. There is a list of missing schools on the frequently asked questions tab, if you want to double check that. But sometimes as well, we zoomed in this image to show the variation as much as possible. So some of the schools, if they're super high spending or super low spending, end up being kind of outliers in these scatter plot images. So all of that information is provided on the missing schools list, but appreciate it. And Daniel, if you could tell me what district you are, we are going to be double checking and making sure that they're truly, quote, missing schools, or if something has happened in our display and our coding. So if you could let me know, that would be great. Thanks.
And Martha's saying, what if it's not so much about the spending as the staffing? Oh, but the staffing is the spending, right? That's where our money goes. The money goes to the staffing. Although maybe what you're trying to say, Martha, is that the money's there, but our staff are really not, it's in the staff, but the staff aren't delivering. And if that is what you suspect, then let's have that conversation, right? Can we have the principals sit down with the teachers and say, here's where we are. We're a high spending school and our kids are lower performing than our peers. The money is here. It's in all of us. Let's figure this out. We often say people need to go through various stages of grief. They're angry, they're, defiant, defensive, depressed, and then they get to the other side and then they can start working on a solution. And I think that may happen. It's okay if we go through some of those stages. We hear sometimes people want to blame the kids first, or blame the parents, or blame this, that, and the other. But then we say, well, we know these kids, and we're the ones with the money's in us. So let's figure it out. How do we chip away at the problems we have? We have a lot of kids who don't come to school. Let's see if we can solve that problem. We have some kids that are really struggling on the reading side. Do we need them to do a boot camp over the summer before they come in? Or we have kids that are in, now have missed a year of math and aren't learning anything. What do we do about that? Can we reach out to the parents for help on some of this? And Sarah's pointing out, display 3 looks solely at elementary schools in a single district and compares them to similar schools in the state. Yes, in display 4 looks solely at high schools in a single district and compares them to all high schools in the state. Yes, Sarah, that's exactly right. And we actually landed on these visualizations from going through all these pilot groups because, we could overwhelm people with different data. And this seemed to be some of the highest value displays for them that they could take and work on now. So we actually have a way to go in and create other kinds of displays in a more customized way. But for the universal tool, it turned out that our team, our whole team who did, the work on our Shiny to create these, it was a lot of work just to get these 4. So that's where we are so far. So if you think there's another high value display that you would prioritize, let me know. We'll let you know if we tried it out in the pilot, but we can also get it to you for a school or some schools. All right. And I think my team will be reading some of the chat because I can't quite see it all.
We're keeping up on it.
Okay. So some common pitfalls, focus solely on what we don't know. We need to know what programs the school implemented before we even have the conversation. I sometimes think, no, just dive into the conversation. Somebody will know what programs are there. Is there a problem with teacher hiring? How well did they perform the year before? We don't necessarily have the answers, but who does often is the school. So if you dig in with the school, they can tell you, well, here's what we think is the issue. And you might as well, they bring that other half of the data, right? That's not on the display. So, I would say, don't hold out for a missing piece of data before having the conversation. Dive in, even if you don't have it all. I think it's fine for people to say, well, yeah, I don't know if we know that, but still we could do this. A lot of people focused only on the metrics or other kinds of flaws. We hear this a lot, that doesn't test mental health, and that's right. But is there something we could learn? A lot of people wanted to avoid saying the obvious when we saw like just a really shocking pattern. People would stare at that and not say a word. Crickets. Our larger investments in the school aren't working for kids. Let's just say it, and then we can start to figure out the problem. The people who have a harder time reading data displays really need us to say this stuff out loud. And then this last one, that giving explanations that don't acknowledge that the districts made the spending choices. So we sometimes hear them saying, well, the state only does this, or the state says that, or the federal government only allows us to do this, and or our union contract requires we do this. All really, in the end, most of the spending is a district's decision, including the labor contract. If you think the labor contract is the biggest thing that's in the way, well, then slowly, start to change it next time around, or really, build the case to change it. So we did find that some comms training can help. We'll just give you a few of these. When the district leader sees something that is upsetting, the yikes kind of thing, whatever it is. Here's what we thought a district leader could say. Looking at the district's expenses from the school lens is new for us, and it reveals some, noteworthy patterns. We're eager to engage with our principals and our community and our board to explore how best to deploy our limited funds to do the most for all our district students. So you're saying, this is new, we see it too, we're looking ahead to figure out where to go from here. And that, it turns out, helps people build trust. If you don't say what you see, they're thinking, oh, either they're blind or they're just trying to hide it. And if you don't, you can sort of acknowledge that we have patterns that, are eye-popping for us too, and we want to work on those going forward. And I think that's a way to take the conversation down a notch. Here's another one, like teacher seniority seems to be driving up spending. No one wants to say that necessarily out loud, but you can. We use a salary scale based on experience. So we're spending more on schools that attract senior teachers. Sometimes just explaining it is the best reaction. That leaves fewer dollars for schools with junior teachers. So we want to engage with our principals and our teachers and our community about options that might both retain our teachers and work better for all of our students. You don't have to have an answer. You can say, we're going to dig in. We got to sort of work on this whole thing. Here's another one. Why is the magnet school so expensive? Well, we put more money there, right? The extra funds we've been applying to our special programs do leave fewer dollars for other schools. People need to know how that fits together, right? This is a good time to explore whether there are ways to protect those programs without drawing funds from other schools and students. So we can just say, let's look in to see if that's something we can do or not. We'll have the conversation. Why is the district giving money to higher poverty schools, or maybe more money to higher poverty schools? That, it turns out, parents do generally understand that if we explain it. Our approach to equity means delivering more resources to students with higher needs. Going forward, we'll try to make that clear by clarifying our allocations by student type. So that could just mean we do that. We even get some federal funds that are, for the most part, earmarked for our highest need schools. Those should amount to maybe, $1,200 a student. You should see those in our spending patterns. Or this one, if the school is so small, why is it so expensive per student? Here, the district, right now is deploying more dollars to its smaller or under-enrolled schools. That does leave fewer dollars for the other schools. So people often think, they're not really, but they don't know how this whole thing fits together. So they think you can spend more money on a small school and it not come from anywhere. But the district has a limited amount of money. So if you spend more on any one school, that's less for the others. And I think reiterating that message, it sort of helps people understand what's at stake and why sometimes not everybody gets everything that they want, right? So there's not a secret ATM in the back room that you can punch in the code and just keep giving out more money. So You can say
So-
that. You can, go ahead.
So Margaret, I thought I would jump in here because we're kind of getting toward the end, but Luke asked a very important question a bit ago. We brought these displays and as a way to provoke thoughtful conversations around spending allocation equity. But he's saying, did any pilot districts commit to adjusting resource allocation patterns based as a response to these or earlier versions of the displays? Not looking for names, but wanting to know if anyone did. So I don't know if you or Jessica want to discuss some of that.
Yes, I just want to put up, this is our last slide, and there's an exit poll here, but how and when would you use this data? We have a bunch of ideas, not the least of which is school district budgeting, which we put in a really big font because that would be a great time to look at them. Resource allocation reviews, looking at your ESSER spending decisions, you know, all those kinds of things. But yeah, so what we did, I would say, Jessica, I don't know if you, I don't think we promised not to use their specific examples, but we did hear about
the different types of actions. Yeah. So some of them, I mean, starting with sharing the data, right? Like we mentioned before, this was the first time the data had been shared. So sharing the data with lots of different types of groups, including taking it to the broader community, not just to sort of the district leadership team or the school board. We also saw districts having a lot more conversations with principals about how to use the money. And we think that's sort of where the change can really start to take place as well. How are they actually using the resources they have? We saw some folks discussing changing allocations, sure. Although the data, you know, there are a lag in the data. And so another thing people did was they looked at what is our ESSER allocation plan? How is this going to look now? So that was another common action. And then we also saw folks digging in on some special programs, talking about, does it make sense for us to have magnet programs in some of these schools, and having conversations about programs. So there are lots of different types of actions that we saw districts take, and they're still taking them. In fact, the districts we worked with even 2 years ago when we started this pilot are still unpacking this and taking it in different directions.
And can we stay on and answer some of these questions? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, Sarah, well, this is kind of the beginning of the rollout. I think we can share this with anyone now, right, Laura?
Yes, we can definitely start sharing it with people, and appreciate, again, anyone's feedback as you're going through, and new data.
Yeah, more data coming, a lot more data coming, hopefully. And just so you have it, here's our contact information on it. But yeah, I think for us, you know, we're hoping people find it useful, can plug it in on some of those. You know, anybody working on a resource allocation review, just go pull up these slides and talk about them. Not these slides, but the actual data in a resource allocation review. It's a great way to just have that conversation, I think. But yeah, I think, you know, districts are going to face a lot of tough decisions ahead as they get close to the fiscal cliff. And they might want to look at their data to see which schools already get more resources than their peers, or which schools are delivering, you know, stronger outcomes as they're going through this. So there's you know, hopefully a lot of applications for this. But as we've learned from data is that if we don't go this last mile and get the data into the hands of the people who are making the decisions in a way that's relevant to the decision, then, you know, the system doesn't use data. So this is our big attempt to do that. We really want to hear from you guys on how it's going.
Great. And Margaret, we also had somebody asking about sharing the slides. And so we will be sending out an email to all the people who participated today with the links and slides and all of that to make sure that everybody gets it. Because I agree, sometimes they're hard to find on the web pages when they get posted. So we'll get that out to everyone.
Yeah, and it's just, let us know if you worked with somebody and they had questions about something. We're learning as we go as well. So the more feedback we can get on these, I think the better, the more we'll grow this tool over time, all those kinds of things. So Everett's saying, you know, resource allocation goes well beyond the money, right? But the problem with not including the money in these conversations is that it becomes the reason why we can't do something. Like our school, you know, we can't do anything for these kids unless we get more money for I don't know, summer programs, or unless we get more money for incentives to get our kids to come back to school or whatever it is. And what people really don't do is take stock of the money they have. And sometimes we might need to use it differently, or just double down, or even convince ourselves that we can solve the problems we have with the people we have. We very often forget that labor is money. And so hopefully by putting money in the conversation, then we can get to that next level conversation about some of these resources. So thank you, everybody. A lot of good dialogue in the chat. I'm going to go back and read it all. So I really appreciate it. A few of you are asking how to get on the mailing list for our future webinars. How do we do that? You can
I'll put it in the chat, Marguerite.
Yeah, email one of us. Just email one of us and we'll put you on the list for sure. See the emails there. Probably easiest one to find is jessica.swanson@georgetown.edu. Yeah, great group. So thank you for coming. And we always love talking about data. I think I'm going to be data for Halloween. Is that a thing? I will have a challenge.
We'd like to see it, Marguerite.
Data for
Emerson says
Halloween,
go for it.
Send me your costumes.
Doug suggested everyone pick their favorite Angela Lansbury character.
Okay.
In her honor.
Okay, good. Excellent. All right. Thank you, everybody.